Alan Wilmer. During the 1980s, Virginia was afflicted by a series of horrific crimes that shook communities to their very foundation. 3 young people became victims of a succession of disturbing murders, leaving grieving families and lingering questions that haunted the region for decades. It all started on September 23, 1987, when the bodies of 29-year-old David Knobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards were found near the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge in Isle of Wight County. Both victims had been fatally shot. In 1989, the murderers struck once more, claiming the life of 20-year-old Teresa Lynn Howell in Hampton. For many years, the killer's identity remained unknown, leaving behind a path of unanswered questions and devastated families. How did these crimes remain unresolved for such a long time? What was the motive? And most significantly, Taylor disappeared on September 19, 1987. The disappearance of David L. Knobling and Robin Edwards sent shockwaves through their respective families and communities. The pair was last seen together on September 19, when Robin left home to meet David at an arcade. The initial alarm was raised by the Knoblings, who noticed David's absence when his younger brother Michael disclosed that he had last seen David driving away in his truck the evening before. Concern quickly escalated into panic as the Knoblings realized that David had not returned home, leading to frantic attempts to find him. Meanwhile, the Edwards family at first treated Robin's absence with relative calm, attributing it to her previous pattern of running away. However, as hours became days without any contact from Robin, their anxiety intensified. Despite Robin's improvement in family counseling sessions, her extended absence aroused suspicions that she might have been taken against her will. With every passing hour, the seriousness of the situation became increasingly evident, prompting both families to reach out to the Virginia State Police and begin a search for the missing pair. On September 21, 1987, Virginia's streets were filled with numerous search parties organized by Virginia police, and these efforts were supported by members of both the Knobling and Edwards families. Search teams concentrated on the last known locations of David and Robin, focusing mainly on Newport News, Hampton, and nearby areas. Among those deeply involved in the search was Carl Knobling, David's father, who went out onto the streets hoping to locate his son. Despite early optimism, fueled by the belief that David might have simply needed some time by himself, the family's hopes were shattered when they encountered a troubling discovery during their search. David's black Ford Ranger pickup truck was found on December 21, 1987, by a patrolman in the Wildlife Refuge's parking lot. The vehicle was still running, with the driver's side window rolled down, the wipers on, and both the engine and radio operating, and several items of clothing were discovered inside. Significantly, both doors had been left open, and the side window was partially lowered. This caused authorities to speculate that the perpetrator may have been impersonating a uniformed officer and had access to such a vehicle. Meanwhile, the presence of Knobling's wallet inside the pickup indicated that robbery was eliminated as a likely motive. However, while detectives viewed this as a step forward, the family felt a deepening sense of dread. They knew David valued his truck and would not voluntarily abandon it. Yet despite their exhaustive efforts, the search parties uncovered no additional leads that day. 4 days later, their bodies were discovered along the shoreline on the south bank of the James River in Isle of Wight County. Neither was fully clothed. Robin's jeans were unbuttoned, and her bra was positioned around her neck. During the autopsy examination of David and Robin's bodies, it was revealed that both victims had sustained gunshot wounds. Robin Edwards had been shot in the back of the head in an execution-style manner, while David Knobling had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the shoulder. At first, investigators were unsure whether a sexual assault had taken place, particularly considering Edwards' underage status. However, significant evidence emerged during the examination, such as Edwards being found with her jeans undone and her bra around her neck. At the scene, detectives struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events that led to David and Robin's deaths. Speculation emerged regarding a possible sexual relationship between David and Robin, despite her being underage. This prompted questions about a potential assault, yet definitive evidence remained lacking, leaving the forensic report unaltered. As the investigation progressed, detectives observed notable similarities to another unsolved murder case from more than a year earlier. The killings of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski both shared a common location, the Colonial Parkway. This finding raised suspicions of a possible serial killer operating in the region. The Colonial Parkway was a quiet roadway winding through Virginia. It had become a favored location for young couples seeking privacy. However, in 1986, it transformed into a nightmare when a killer began targeting couples. Kathleen and Rebecca were the first victims. They were discovered dead in their car with their throats cut. The killer struck again in 1987. This time, David and Robin were likely his victims. Both cases shared chilling similarities and occurred near the Parkway. This prompted detectives to search for a pattern. It became evident that the crime scenes were staged and couples were being targeted. Despite ongoing investigations, the killer remained unidentified, leaving families devastated and communities living in fear. The Colonial Parkway, once regarded as a symbol of romance, became linked with tragedy and terror. With investigations continuing, detectives hoped the disturbing double homicides would be the last in Virginia. Sadly, their hopes were shattered as additional bloodshed followed. Less than 7 months after the deaths of David and Robin, another tragic double homicide took place. This time, the victims were 18-year-old Cassandra Haley and 20-year-old Richard Keith Call, both students at Christopher Newport University. They disappeared after attending a party, never returning to their classes. Initially, detectives believed that the couple might have drowned in the York River, but despite an extensive search, no bodies were recovered, and their remains have still not been located. With more than 6 people murdered and no answers, residents lived in continual fear. Then once again, a horrifying call reached investigators. This time, a construction crew made a grim discovery near their work site. About 5 miles from Hampton, they came across women's clothing, and the body of an unidentified woman was found in a nearby wooded area. She was identified as Teresa Lynn Spa-Howell. Teresa's body was identified through a missing persons report that had been filed in New York County on July 4, 1989. A subsequent autopsy revealed that Teresa had been assaulted and had died due to strangulation. Teresa was born on August 25, 1960, in Annapolis, Maryland, to Malden Pierce Spa and the late Betty Elizabeth Jeffries Spa. She was a devoted mother to her 2 children, Elijah and Nicole, who lived in San Antonio, Texas. Living alone in the Pines of York Apartments complex on Route 134, Teresa faced the difficulties of unemployment and separation from her husband. During the investigation into Teresa's disappearance, it was discovered that on July 1, 1989, she went out to a popular venue known as the Zodiac Club on East Mercury Boulevard in Hampton, Virginia. Her intention was to enjoy a fun evening and leave her past behind. However, her night took a dark turn when she went missing shortly after departing the nightclub. Tragically, no one noticed her absence until it was too late. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the Virginia State Police received a troubling call. A construction worker from York County reported finding a trail of women's clothing scattered about, which led him to a woman's body in a wooded area at the 500 block of Butler Farm Road. Authorities promptly responded to the location, which was part of the developing Hampton Road Center off Magruder Boulevard. It took 3 days to identify the victim, who was confirmed to be Teresa. After a missing persons report was filed on July 4, 1989, investigators quickly began working to reconstruct Teresa's final hours. Initial findings showed that Teresa, 29 years old at the time, was last seen leaving the Zodiac nightclub around 2:30 a.m., although it was too soon to officially declare her missing. 7 hours passed before the construction worker reported discovering her location. Her body was found only 4 miles from her apartment complex and 5 miles from the nightclub. Further investigation revealed troubling connections to the double homicide of David and Robin, whose bodies had been discovered 15 miles away 2 years earlier. Like Robin Edwards, Teresa had likewise been sexually assaulted, with strangulation identified as the cause of death. However, despite the links to David and Robin's case, detectives did not categorize Teresa's death as part of the Colonial Parkway killings. Nevertheless, they firmly believed that the same murderer was responsible. In the aftermath of Teresa Howell's murder, Virginia authorities were on high alert, determined to stop further bloodshed. Yet on September 5, 1989, tragedy struck once more as 2 additional individuals disappeared: 21-year-old Daniel Lauer and 18-year-old Anna-Marie Phelps. Daniel's car, a Chevrolet Nova, was found abandoned at a westbound rest stop off Interstate 64 in New Kent County. The car was strangely positioned on the acceleration ramp, the doors unlocked, and the keys left in the ignition. Anna-Marie's purse was discovered inside, along with Daniel's packed luggage in the back seat. At first, detectives considered the possibility that the pair had run away, but the investigation quickly dismissed this idea. The scene bore the hallmarks of the Colonial Parkway killer's modus operandi, which involved staging vehicles to appear abandoned in order to lure unsuspecting victims. Despite immediate search efforts, the dense forest surrounding the area made locating Daniel and Anna-Marie difficult. Even aerial searches yielded no results. Weeks went by, marked by heavy rain that further complicated the search. Hope diminished until 7 weeks later, a grim discovery was made by turkey hunters. The decomposed bodies of Daniel and Anna-Marie were found. Covered with an electric blanket taken from Daniel's car, the bodies were located on a narrow, secluded trail. Anna-Marie's locket was recovered nearby. Forensic examination, though hindered by advanced decomposition, revealed multiple stab wounds on Anna-Marie's remains. Daniel's cause of death remained undetermined due to the extent of decomposition. As you can see, the similarities to the earlier Colonial Parkway cases were undeniable. Authorities believed the killer, referred to as the Colonial Parkway murderer, sought to replicate his previous atrocities. Staging Daniel's car mirrored the pattern observed with earlier victims, serving as a chilling reminder of the killer's taunts. Despite relentless efforts, authorities faced mounting frustration as the elusive killer continued to evade capture, leaving a trail of bloodshed behind. The Phantom of Colonial remained a shadowy figure, outmaneuvering authorities at every turn. The investigation into the Colonial Parkway murders had reached a standstill. 6 long years had passed, and the killer remained at large. Some detectives proposed a theory that the murderer might have ties to law enforcement, given the staged condition of the victims' vehicles. The partially lowered driver's window suggested possible impersonation of an officer, but attempts to connect the killer to law enforcement were unsuccessful. It appeared the killer had managed to obtain a uniform to carry out his crimes. Shifting their focus to links between the cases, detectives revisited the murder of Teresa Spa Howell. Although initially handled as a separate case, similarities to the Colonial Parkway killings were apparent. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Detective Eddie Watts, investigators explored 2 theories regarding Teresa's death. The first proposed that she was killed elsewhere before being left at the construction site. The second suggested that the killer staged the crime scene to mislead investigators. Yet without solid evidence, both theories fell apart. As pressure increased from the Spa family, the investigation was reassigned. It was now led by Detective Edgar Browning. In May 1995, what seemed like a breakthrough occurred with the arrest of Clinton Wayne Edwards. It was based entirely on witness statements and DNA evidence. Edwards was charged with capital murder. However, further examination uncovered errors in the DNA evidence, resulting in Edwards' release. The embarrassment of Edwards' wrongful arrest represented a setback for authorities. Despite persistent efforts, the case went cold, with no viable theories left to pursue. 7 years had passed, leaving detectives discouraged and families without closure. Then in December 2020, FBI Special Agent Brian Dugan assumed leadership of the FBI Norfolk Field Office. Determined to solve the case, Dugan carefully reviewed the evidence and witness statements. Finally, in late 2023, a breakthrough took place. Dugan had directed his team to retest DNA samples from the crime scene, despite skepticism from some investigators. To their astonishment, a clear match emerged. The DNA linked to the double homicide of David Knobling and Robin Edwards also matched samples from Teresa Howell's murder. The discovery revived hope of solving the cold cases. Further investigation traced the DNA to Alan Wilmer, a man who had died of natural causes in 2017. His DNA, which had been entered into the database during his post-mortem examination, resurfaced as a match to the Colonial Parkway murders, revealing Wilmer's identity. Authorities launched an intensive investigation into his life. After 36 years, the killer finally had a name. The breakthrough represented a major milestone in the pursuit of justice for the victims and their families. Alan W. Wilmer Sr., the alleged Colonial Parkway killer, had actually died in December 2017 in Lancaster County, Virginia, at the age of 63. His body was not found for a month. His death brought an end to a lengthy investigation that connected him to 3 homicides. Born on November 18, 1954, in Lancaster County, Virginia, Wilmer was recognized for his solitary disposition. He lived alone at his home on Meyer Creek Road in Lancaster County. Although he had previously been married, the marriage ended in divorce, and he had 2 adult children. Notably, Wilmer drove a distinctive blue 1966 Dodge Fargo pickup truck bearing the Virginia license plate MRA. This truck was only one of several pickups Wilmer owned and operated during the 1980s and early 1990s. In addition to his truck, Wilmer also possessed a small commercial fishing boat named the Denny Wade. This 1976 custom-built wooden vessel was used for clam and oyster farming. It was primarily docked at marinas in Gloucester and Middle Essex counties and around the Northern Neck region. He was also a passionate hunter and was a member of at least one hunt club in the Middle Peninsula region. Wilmer's occupation as a fisherman allowed him to spend considerable time at sea on his commercial boat. Yet despite his reserved personality, Wilmer maintained an active lifestyle, frequently participating in hunting activities and taking part in local hunt clubs. However, his reclusive behavior and his familiarity with the Virginia terrain made him a primary suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders. While Wilmer kept a clean criminal record, investigations uncovered his earlier involvement as a suspect in the double homicide case of Cassandra Haley and Richard Call. Witnesses reported seeing him approach the couple along the Colonial Parkway, leading to FBI surveillance under Special Agent Irvin B. Wells in 2016. During surveillance conducted after the deaths of Richard and Cassandra, agents observed Alan Wilmer engaging in suspicious actions, including spray painting and cleaning one of his older trucks. This conduct raised concerns, prompting agents to secure a search warrant for his residence. However, the search produced little incriminating evidence, with only a registered firearm, explicit materials, and handcuffs found. Despite their suspicions, agents did not have sufficient evidence to detain Wilmer. During interrogations, Wilmer insisted on his innocence. To further verify his innocence, agents asked Wilmer to take a lie detector test, and he willingly agreed. A well-known polygraph examiner administered the test, ultimately determining that Wilmer was truthful. Nevertheless, Special Agent Wells remained persuaded of Wilmer's involvement in the Colonial Parkway murders, though without solid evidence, resulting in Wilmer's release. After this encounter, Wilmer disappeared from law enforcement's attention until his death on December 15, 2017. His inclusion in the DNA database after his death provided critical evidence, connecting him to 3 of the 9 crime scenes linked to the Parkway murders. On January 8, 2024, the Virginia State Police officially identified Wilmer as the primary suspect in the 1987 double homicide case of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. Multiple law enforcement agencies repeated this announcement, revealing Wilmer's involvement in the death and assault of Teresa Spa Howell in 1989. However, because Wilmer had died on December 15, 2017, at the age of 63, he could not be prosecuted for his crimes. Even though Wilmer had been identified during this entire time, Virginia State Police spokeswoman Ms. Corinne Geller clarified that, despite continued efforts, there was currently no physical or forensic evidence linking Wilmer to the other 6 murders. The account of Alan Wade Wilmer's connection to the Colonial Parkway murders continues to leave many detectives perplexed. It demonstrates how challenging it can be for police to resolve such old cold cases with no clear trail. And perhaps it also illustrates how God's hand may play a significant role in such matters. Reflecting on the lives that were lost, it was not only David Knobling, Robin Edwards, and Teresa Howell. There were many additional individuals who became victims of this madman. There remains the lingering question: was Wilmer truly the sole person behind these horrific crimes, or could there be others still out there? Moving on to the next case. Alice Hainsworth Ryan. During the late 1980s, Greenville, South Carolina was undergoing a transformation, casting off its industrial history to emerge as a flourishing hub of commerce and culture. Yet directly amid this transformation, a startling crime committed in broad daylight shook the community. On October 8, 1988, 80-year-old socialite Alice Hainsworth Ryan was tragically slain in her elegant Tudor mansion in Greenville shortly after coming back from a chemotherapy appointment. What made matters worse was that the case would remain unsolved until 3 lengthy decades had gone by. Who could commit such a vile act against a defenseless person? And what circumstances contributed to the extended delay in achieving justice? Born into a distinguished family on January 24, 1908, Alice was raised in a world of privilege and prominence in Greenville. She was the sole daughter of her parents, Harry J. Hainsworth and Rhoda Livingston Hainsworth. Alice was also cherished by her brother, Knox Livingston Hainsworth, and half-brother, Clement Furman Hainsworth, who was from her father's other marriage. From the moment she came into the world, she was destined for a life of luxury and influence. Her father, a successful attorney, had founded one of Greenville's most respected law firms. By the time Alice was born, the firm had already thrived for more than a decade. Alice was a lively young girl who knew her own mind and was used to getting her way. With her captivating beauty and charm, Alice was no stranger to admiration, as men considered her gorgeous and enchanting. However, she remained primarily devoted to her studies. In 1929, Greenville received a handsome newcomer named Joseph Murphy Ryan, affectionately known as Joe, arriving from Ireland to oversee a southern office for his family's textile business. Joe differed from Alice's usual social circle, being Catholic, affluent, and notably a Yankee raised in Troy, New York. Their romance developed swiftly, with friends remembering them as a striking couple. They exchanged vows in a simple ceremony at Alice's parents' residence, followed by an extravagant 3-week honeymoon in Bermuda. After they returned, they began constructing their dream home, a vast 5,000-square-foot Tudor mansion situated on 2 acres of Woodland Way. This would become her refuge for the next half-century before her life was tragically cut short. Alice and Joe's marriage started on a strong footing, and their connection only strengthened with the arrival of their son, Joe Ryan Jr. It was followed by the births of their 2 daughters, Catherine and Rhoda, the latter named in tribute to Alice's mother. As a wealthy socialite, Alice never worked, with a cook, maid and nanny to help with their children. Alice enjoyed a life of ease and extravagance. However, everything shifted for Alice when her husband Joe sadly died from a ruptured appendix in 1950 at 42 years old with 3 children still young. Alice inherited a mortgage-free home and assets amounting to $1.5 million. Despite the financial stability, the death of her husband weighed heavily on Alice's happiness. For the following 3 decades, Alice stayed in the same house, choosing to live alone after her children had moved away. Alice lived a life filled with contradictions. She could be both flamboyant and reserved, enjoying the company of many, but spending her final years in seclusion with her beloved Cocker Spaniel Sassy. Her children knew her as self-reliant and brave, though they often worried about her residing alone without a security system. It was not until the later years of her life that they persuaded her to secure the doors of her enormous home. But before any of that could have an impact, something else emerged. In late 1987, at the age of 79, Alice experienced a health scare when pneumonia exposed cancer in her lung. Always private, she shared this news only with her closest family. But she was required to undergo a schedule of 8 monthly chemotherapy sessions to fight the disease. While she seemed to be prevailing in the battle, the exhausting treatment took a toll on her health. However, no one anticipated that her opportunity for survival would be suddenly taken away. That Saturday morning on October 8, 1988, Alice woke to the sounds of St. Francis Hospital eager to go back home. She had spent the prior 2 nights in the hospital for chemotherapy, which had been nearly unbearable. With only 1 more session remaining, she hoped to leave this chapter behind her. Throughout Alice's illness, her devoted children had arranged a routine to make sure she received the best possible care. Rhoda drove her to the hospital on Thursday, October 6, 1988, and remained most of the day. Joe Ryan visited his mother that evening, but could not stay long due to his obligations to the family textile business. Catherine was responsible for picking up her mom from the hospital and staying with her at home until Monday morning. Following the arrangement, Catherine collected her mom from the hospital around 1:45 p.m. on October 8, 1988. Once they returned to the Tudor mansion, Catherine helped her mom settle on the sofa in the den, which was the room farthest from the kitchen, so she could watch the Dodgers-Mets game. After a short telephone conversation with Rhoda around 2:30 p.m., Catherine decided to get something for lunch while Alice said she would go upstairs to unpack as the mother-daughter said goodbye to each other. None of them realized that it would be their final farewell. After being away from home for only 40 minutes, just enough time to pick up some hot dogs, onion rings, apple, muffins, and dog food. Around 3:10 p.m. Catherine drove into her mother's driveway. As she neared the back door, She immediately saw that the pane nearest to the doorknob was shattered. Catherine also thought it strange that Sassy, her mother's canine companion, did not come running to greet her. As she stepped into the kitchen, Catherine came upon a scene that would forever haunt her. There, on the floor against the peeling radiator, lay her mother, Alice, unmoving. Her right arm lay awkwardly across her body, and nearby scattered belongings told a grim story. Black flats were tossed aside, a gold rope necklace scattered beside her, while 2 diamond rings remained undisturbed on her fingers. Alice's silk turban, now marked with blood, lay several feet away, exposing her bare head. Her brown trousers were intact, but her pink turtleneck and brown sweater had been pushed up, revealing darkened wounds on her abdomen. A chilling sight that no daughter should ever have to see. Terrified and panicked, Catherine rushed outside to seek assistance. She first hurried through the backyard to a house on McDaniel Avenue, but found no cars parked outside. She then went to the neighboring house. But again, there was no sign of anyone. With desperation increasing, she ran across the sloping front lawn and managed to flag down a passing white Jeep. The driver, Raymond Schroeder, urged Catherine not to go back into the house, fearing that the attacker might still be inside. He suggested she get into his vehicle so they could locate a phone, but Catherine refused and instead headed toward another neighbor's house. Meanwhile, Raymond drove off to the 8 o'clock super at a nearby grocery store and placed a call to 911 at 3:19 p.m. Just 2 minutes later, at 3:21 p.m., Catherine made her own call to 911 from a house on McDaniel Avenue. At approximately 3:30 p.m. Greenville police arrived at the crime scene and quickly sealed off the area with yellow crime scene tape, beginning a careful inspection of the premises. Inside the house, apart from 2 open drawers, one in the kitchen containing knives, and the other in a living room end table, nothing appeared disturbed. Forensic specialists quickly determined that Alice had died from stab wounds. News of the crime spread swiftly, shocking the community. Although murder was not unheard of in certain Greenville neighborhoods, this kind of ruthless killing was unprecedented. Joe and Rhoda rushed to the scene, desperate to understand the incomprehensible. As members of the community gathered outside the house, there was widespread confusion, with many coming and going, taking photographs and asking questions. These questions reflected those swirling in the minds of the investigators. Who could commit such a heinous act? What motive lay behind this terrible crime? And if robbery was the perpetrator's aim, why resort to such a crude method as throwing a rock through a window? It seemed amateurish, not the work of an experienced burglar. Almost at once, suspicions focused on a seemingly troubled man who had inexplicably taken up residence in Alice's pool house several months earlier. The strange encounter began in July 1988 when Grace Gordon, Allison's maid of 40 years, chose to clean the pool house while Alice was undergoing treatment at St. Francis Hospital. Forcing her way through the bushes, Grace opened the unlocked door to discover a man inside, singing to himself. When Grace asked him who he was, the 27-year-old sturdy man identified himself as Billy. Alarmed, Grace rushed to notify Rhoda, Alice's daughter. But by the time Rhoda and the police arrived, Billy had disappeared. About 2 months later, Grace saw the same man in the backyard heading toward the pool house. She immediately contacted Joe, Alice's son. Joe was stunned to find furniture rearranged, frozen chicken thawing on the counter, and a pack of pools resting on a table. Ashes were scattered in the fireplace. Joe decided to wait, and approximately 30 minutes later, Billy returned carrying a stereo and 2 speakers. The police were called once again. They confiscated his belongings, including his stereo and clothes. However, since he had only entered by tampering with the lock, the judge could only issue a trespass warning. A few days later, Billy came back to collect his belongings. Grace left him waiting on the porch. When Alice came downstairs, she discovered him inside the living room, playing her piano. Despite Alice being only 5 feet, 2 inches tall, she held her ground against the 6-foot, 1-inch man. Remembered Alice escorting him to the door, warning him to stay away. However, a mere 12 days later, when Alice was murdered, the children voiced concern that their mother, who feared nothing and possessed a sharp tongue, might have provoked the anger of a disturbed individual. Police swiftly arrested Billy at his residence later that afternoon, only to be met with disappointment when Woodside Mill neighbors confirmed having seen him throughout the afternoon. To further unravel the mystery of the murder, the police enlisted Joe and Catherine's assistance in identifying any missing items. Although they could not immediately detect anything out of place, it soon became clear that Alice's 1967 Ford Fairlane was missing from the scene. They did not have to wait long before the car was found at 4:30 p.m. A resident of Bunwood Lane, a narrow winding road nearby, alerted the police that the car had been blocking the street since 3:55 p.m. For lead detective Dave Henderson, the location seemed perfect for abandoning a stolen vehicle. A nearby telephone pole fitted with steps could have provided the perpetrator with a way to climb over a wooden fence and into the neighboring Nicoletown area. Despite passing numerous houses and leaving the car in the middle of a heavily populated street less than a mile from Alice's residence, no residents saw the driver. Alice's house key was discovered next to the car, but the car key was nowhere to be located. The murder weapon, a flathead screwdriver with a black and yellow handle, was found in a ravine near where the car had been abandoned. Unfortunately, the screwdriver did not produce any fingerprints. Additionally, a bloodstained dish towel with orange and white stripes traced back to Alice's pantry was also recovered. However, aside from these items, little physical evidence was obtained from the scene or the car. The autopsy report revealed chilling details. There were no signs of defensive wounds, hair or skin beneath Alice's fingernails. Weakened by chemotherapy, the fragile woman could not put up a fight. She died from 4 knife wounds to her back and abdomen, but a total of 33 stab wounds covered her body. It was a pure act of brutality. Deputy Coroner Park Evans described it as overkill, suggesting that the attacker acted in a burst of rage, driven by powerful emotions. As the details of the murder circulated, neighbors grew increasingly uneasy. Many installed burglar alarms, watched for strangers, and made sure their doors were firmly locked. During the police investigation, a key witness surfaced. A 16-year-old girl who lived half a mile from Alice's house. She reported seeing a white car speeding backward down Alice's driveway around the time of the murder. Remarkably, she identified the car in police custody as the very one she had nearly collided with. While she could not provide a detailed description of the driver, she remembered that they had dark hair. Dozens of patrolmen, detectives, and sled agents fanned out across Greenville to interview the various workmen Alice had employed in the past. Detectives also spoke with neighbors and their household staff. Despite their efforts, the interviews initially produced no useful information. However, when officers visited Cleveland Park Stables, a woman who gave riding lessons reported seeing Alice's Ford sedan at 2:45 p.m. on that fateful Saturday, startling her horse. Although she could not discern who the driver was, she was confident of the time. Unfortunately, even this lead failed to generate any concrete results. It seemed as though the murderer had simply disappeared without a trace. With no clues to pursue, detectives decided to re-examine the old evidence with fresh eyes. Since the autopsy had revealed knife wounds, detectives Forrest Bushbanton and Paul Stambo returned to the ravine where the screwdriver had been found. By chance, they discovered a 13-inch butcher knife blade. It had been wiped as cleanly as the screwdriver. They combed the woods with a metal detector, searching for Alice's car key. Again, no success. Frustrated by the lack of progress, detectives chose to publicize the investigation by filming a Crime Stoppers segment, hoping to generate leads. However, the segment produced hardly any useful tips. Meanwhile, investigators carefully reviewed the evidence, but most fingerprints were smudged or belonged to known family members. Yet they found one clear palm print on a wall that did not match anyone associated with the household. Police believed that identifying the owner of this print could be critical to securing a conviction. Additionally, detectives reviewed records of known burglars and submitted fingerprints to the FBI to develop a psychological profile of the killer. Then a potential breakthrough occurred. Officers in Anderson, South Carolina, arrested 2 men suspected of being connected to the murder of Albert L. Mudd Osteen, a 77-year-old man who had been stabbed with both a knife and a screwdriver in his upscale home. The similarities between this case and Alice's murder raised hopes that a solid lead had been found. Since the crime nearly mirrored Alice Ryan's murder, detectives thought they had their suspect. As it turned out, they were again pursuing the wrong lead. The men had been at work when Alice was killed, their supervisor told authorities. 8 days after the murder, a man informed detectives that his 8-year-old daughter had found a Ford key lying in plain view on Fernwood Lane. Detective Henderson believed his officers might have overlooked the key, which turned out to be Alice's, but his intuition suggested the killer had returned and discarded the key. Then the FBI supplied its psychological profile, indicating that the killer was a man familiar with the neighborhood who may have observed Catherine leaving and decided to burglarize the house. According to the FBI's analysis, Alice likely tried to defend herself with a butcher knife. In a panicked and enraged state, the assailant then used a screwdriver to stab her before seizing the knife and stabbing her again. However, detectives noted that the report did not materially advance the investigation. By December 1988, with 3 additional unsolved murders compounding the city's problems, the Greenville police chief formed a 10-member homicide task force. Around the same time, Detective Henderson received information from Nicholson residents indicating that 2 men had been seen driving Alice's car on the day of her death. The residents described the car as having black electrical tape along the side, which matched the description of Alice's missing vehicle. Moreover, the car had been unaccounted for about an hour that afternoon. According to the residents, one of the men was someone Detective Henderson knew. This individual had previously avoided arrest by Henderson when he jumped from a second-story window while being pursued for robbing a shoe store. However, before investigators could apprehend the second man, he had already died. This development marked the 3rd time investigators believed they were on the brink of solving the case, only to have the resolution slip away once again. Months later, the family endured another loss. Sassy, Alice's loyal companion, who had suffered superficial stab wounds during the attack, was taken in by a police officer. However, 6 months later, suffering from blindness and kidney failure, she was euthanized. The investigation, one of the most extensive in Greenville's history, involved numerous officers from the Greenville Police Department and several agents from the State Law Enforcement Division. Nearly 300 people were interviewed regarding the 1988 murder, with roughly 60 considered potential suspects. Despite these efforts, the trail remained cold, leaving investigators empty-handed and the case unresolved. They packed 2 large cardboard boxes with incident reports, tape recordings, interview notes, and crime scene photos. The significance of Alice Ryan's identity as a scion of one of Greenville's most prominent legal families was not lost on them. Alice's family also publicly offered a $10,000 reward to anyone who could provide information leading to the identification of the killer or assisting the case. Despite the large scale of the investigation and the multitude of leads pursued, every avenue explored seemed to end in a dead end. While the investigation remained open, it had reached a standstill. As months turned into years, the murder became the Greenville Police Department's most frustrating case, eventually going cold for nearly 3 decades. In the aftermath of Alice Ryan's tragic death, each of her children coped with the loss in their own way. Joe Ryan, then 53, took on the role of a reserve police officer. Although he was not officially involved in his mother's case, he stayed connected with the investigators, asking questions and offering support wherever he could. Catherine Stribling, then 51, wrestled with feelings of guilt, wondering if things might have been different had she acted differently, such as leaving out a screwdriver that could have been used as the murder weapon. She also bore the weight of regret for rushing to get help when she discovered her mother's body. Meanwhile, then 48, had to confront her own struggles. She became a stoic presence amid the swirling rumors that circulated in Greenville at the time. Throughout it all, they yearned for justice for their mother and sought a path toward healing from the profound tragedy. However, it would be many years before any breakthrough emerged, offering a glimmer of hope in a case shrouded in mystery for so long. The establishment of the Cold Case Unit in 2017 marked a turning point in Greenville's unsolved homicides, including Alice Hainsworth Ryan's case. The unit comprised 2 retired local officers and a former FBI agent who volunteered their expertise. With renewed determination, the investigators re-examined the evidence, utilizing modern technology and fresh perspectives. In April 2017, DNA extracted from a cigarette, but found in Ryan's recovered vehicle, was sent to the State Law Enforcement Division by the Cold Case Unit. From there, a DNA profile was created and uploaded into the FBI's CODIS database for potential matches. This critical piece of evidence, preserved over the years, finally had the opportunity to produce results thanks to advances in forensic science. In late 2017, a breakthrough occurred when a match was found with a registered sex offender living in Americus, Georgia. Officers conducted interviews with the individual, identified as 51-year-old Brian Keith Munns. In December 2017, They obtained saliva samples through a search warrant to confirm a DNA match. Upon verification in February 2019, investigators proceeded with criminal charges against Munns. On February 15, 2019, Munns was apprehended in Georgia and later extradited to Greenville to face charges of possession of a stolen vehicle and accessory after the fact to murder. However, the arrest was kept confidential. As the investigation continued, authorities chose not to publicize the arrest to preserve the integrity of the ongoing case, allowing them to corroborate statements provided by witnesses and informants. Following the arrest, cold case detectives conducted over 30 interviews. Those interviews provided detailed information about Alice's death, enabling investigators to file additional charges against Munns. On May 6, 2019, Greenville Police Chief Ken Miller made the news public. The charges brought against him in February 2019 were dismissed on May 16, 2019. Subsequently, on the same day, detectives filed new charges against him, including murder, burglary, armed robbery, and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. Looking into Munn's background, detectives discovered that much of his family history remained a mystery. Born in 1968, he attended America's High School in Sumter County and pursued studies at Charlotte Diesel Driving School. For most of his life, he worked as a truck driver. However, his criminal record revealed a troubling past. Munns had been in legal trouble in South Carolina since the early 1990s. In 1991, he was convicted of larceny and strong-arm robbery in Colombia. Later in 1998, he faced charges of first-degree criminal conduct. He ultimately pleaded guilty in 2001, resulting in a period of incarceration until May 2007. Despite being released on probation afterward, Munns returned to prison in August 2008 after his community supervision was revoked. He was released on probation again in May 2009, only to have his freedom cut short as he violated the terms of his release by failing to register as a sex offender. Consequently, his community supervision was revoked once more in July 2009. Munns completed his sentence and was released in October 2009. Although Munns likely did not know Alice, he lived near Fernwood Lane, less than a mile from Ryan's home at the time of her murder in 1988. However, the case took another twist. The investigation led police to another man, Lamar Green, who was seen with Munns on the day Alice was killed. Green had been a known burglar back in 1988 and had been a suspect from the early days of the investigation, but he died a few months after Alice's murder before authorities could confirm him as the killer. However, with a long history of encounters with the law, Munns had his way of keeping silent. Even after being booked and charged, he remained quiet on the advice of his counsel. It was not until he dismissed his first lawyer that circumstances changed. As local prosecutors prepared for trial and were poised to proceed, Munns followed his new lawyer's advice and chose to tell authorities his side of the story. He admitted to being in the car with Green on the day in question, claiming the killer had attempted to sell it to him. However, Munns firmly insisted that he never entered the Ryan mansion. According to Munns, Green was the one with blood on his hands. Surprisingly, police accepted his account. Deputy Solicitor William McCaster said, based on the evidence, "We felt this all made sense." In September 2021, Munns entered a guilty plea for misprision of a felony, acknowledging his failure to report the crime he had concealed for decades. As part of the plea agreement, the other charges against him were dropped. Brian Munns received a 4-year sentence in state prison, but was released with credit for time served. For Alice Hainsworth Ryan's children, Munns' plea provided a measure of closure to a long-standing chapter of pain and uncertainty. Joe Jr. expressed gratitude to the investigators, who never stopped searching for his mother's killer. Though the scars of the past remain, the resolution marks the end of a solemn chapter and a step toward healing for the family. Moving on to the next case. Elizabeth. November 4, 1994, began like any other day in Fredericksburg. The sun was shining, and Rossetti set out for her routine morning walk. But as she strolled along her usual route, something caught her attention. Around 8 a.m. Elizabeth's front door was unlocked and slightly ajar, which struck Rossetti as unusual. She found it odd because it was still early in the morning, and Elizabeth had not gone out the day before either. So if Elizabeth had gone somewhere that morning, it was strange that she would leave her door open. Concerned for her neighbor's well-being, Rossetti decided to investigate further. She entered Elizabeth's house and called out her name repeatedly, but there was no response. Elizabeth was nowhere to be found inside, but what she saw next sent chills down her spine. The house was in disarray, with furniture overturned, as if a violent struggle had occurred. A shattered statue lay in pieces, a grim indication of the violence that had taken place. As she surveyed the scene, her eyes fell upon drops of blood on the floor, along with a bloody footprint leading upstairs, directly toward Elizabeth's room. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Rossetti realized that something terrible had happened to Elizabeth. Despite calling her name twice more, there was no response. With a heavy heart and growing dread, she entered Elizabeth's room, only to encounter a horrifying sight. There, lying lifeless on the bed with her face buried in the pillows, was Elizabeth. It was a scene of utter devastation. Elizabeth's head was bloody, her eyes swollen, and her body covered in cuts and bruises, including injuries to her head and neck. Rossetti's eyes widened in shock as she noticed a ligature tightly wrapped around Elizabeth's neck, indicating a violent and tragic end to her life. As Rossetti gazed at the scarf around Elizabeth's neck, it became apparent that it may have caused her death. With trembling hands, she called 911 for help. Before long, crime scene analyst John Lippincott, one of the first detectives on the scene, arrived to investigate. Lippincott's initial impression was that a fierce struggle had occurred downstairs, judging by the chaos throughout the house. It appeared that Elizabeth had been caught off guard by someone she did not expect, resulting in a violent confrontation. What puzzled him, however, was that no one had heard any sounds of the fight, particularly Rossetti, who lived nearby. Despite her proximity, she had been unaware of any disturbances. Following the struggle downstairs, the attacker had forcefully assaulted Elizabeth and tragically ended her life upstairs. Elizabeth's body was quickly taken for a detailed autopsy, which revealed critical information about her injuries. The examination uncovered scratches on both sides of her neck and compression marks on her nose, suggesting she had been punched forcefully. However, disappointingly, no evidence of semen was found, which might have provided valuable clues to identify her killer. Even after this setback, investigators were determined to uncover more evidence. An investigator sent Elizabeth's clothing and bedding to the state crime lab, hoping that forensic analysis would reveal traces of the perpetrator's bodily fluids. Meanwhile, in Fredericksburg, the search for Elizabeth's killer was in full swing. Investigators began by interviewing locals and neighbors, eager to find any indications of unusual behavior or events in Elizabeth's life leading up to her death. They wanted to know if she had confided in anyone about feeling afraid, or if anything unusual had caught their attention. Authorities then learned about a man who had been with Elizabeth on the night she died. She had visited Merriman's, a local bar, with a man named Matt. They spent the evening together, sharing drinks and seemingly enjoying each other's company. Despite their interactions, nothing about their behavior appeared suspicious or out of the ordinary to those around them. Detective Muselman promptly tracked down Matt and questioned him about his connection to Elizabeth. Matt recounted their evening and mentioned that after leaving the bar, they had sat in his car and talked for a while. Despite the casual conversation, nothing seemed significant. They had simply discussed how enjoyable their evening had been. While Matt's account did not initially provide any breakthrough leads, every detail was important for detectives working to solve the case. Matt insisted that he had bid Elizabeth good night around 10 p.m. and returned home. He maintained that he had not seen or interacted with Elizabeth since that night. As the last person known to have seen her alive, detectives naturally focused on Matt as a potential suspect. Despite thorough questioning, detectives were unable to uncover any substantial evidence linking Matt to Elizabeth's murder. With no proof connecting him to the crime, Matt was soon cleared as a suspect and released. Determined to find answers, detectives turned their attention to the residents of River Place, exploring the possibility that someone there might have been responsible for Elizabeth's death. However, the investigation produced no significant leads, as none of the potential suspects had any compelling evidence tying them to the crime. Even after their best efforts, the detectives repeatedly hit dead ends. Months passed without any new leads or evidence emerging, and the trail went cold. The case file was eventually placed in storage, where it sat, collecting dust for years, unsolved and largely forgotten. It seemed as though the killer had vanished, leaving the truth behind Elizabeth's murder buried with them. But just when all seemed lost, a breakthrough emerged, renewing hope for justice and bringing new momentum to the long-dormant case. On a sunny day in June 1995, a man named Archie L. Mortelli, who was homeless, arrived at the Fredericksburg Police Department. Archie had called the pavement under a bridge his home, where he had lived for some time. Yet something compelled him to leave his usual spot and navigate the streets until he reached the local police station. Once there, he found himself standing before Lieutenant Muselman's desk, ready to share his story. This unexpected visit marked the beginning of a significant development in the investigation. Tally recounted a frightening encounter, describing how a man and a woman had approached him under the bridge and threatened to harm him because of his sexual orientation. Tally was terrified, as he did not recognize these individuals and had never met them before. This unexpected confrontation left him feeling vulnerable and fearful for his safety. After speaking with Tally, the detectives felt a glimmer of hope that the couple he described could be connected to Elizabeth's murder. They revisited the bridge where Tally had been living and questioned everyone in the area about seeing such a couple. Despite following up on every lead, the detectives reached a dead end. They could not find any connection between Elizabeth and the individuals Tally had mentioned. Over time, the lead he provided gradually faded from the detectives' minds as they continued their efforts to solve the case. A year later, despite tireless work, investigators had little to show for their efforts, and the investigation again reached a dead end. The community was left with lingering questions. Who was truly responsible for Elizabeth's murder? Would the perpetrator ever be brought to justice? With each passing day, the case remained unresolved, leaving everyone wondering if answers would ever come. Then, in 2002, a glimmer of hope appeared as the files were reopened. After years of living under a bridge and being homeless, Tally had made significant progress in his life. 7 years later, he had improved his circumstances and now resided in a second-story flat with his current boyfriend. However, tensions started to rise between them, which caused disorder in Tally's household. Feeling frightened of Tally, his boyfriend chose to contact the police. During their discussion, he disclosed that Tally had been considering the disturbing notion of killing him while he slept. Tally's boyfriend provided alarming details to Detective Perkins, stating that Tally not only threatened his life, but also bragged about having committed murder previously, and intended to do the same to him. Shocked by this information, Perkins recognized the urgency of the matter. He believed that discovering more about Tally's past victims was essential, particularly since a killer was at large. Determined to obtain further information, Perkins formulated a plan to ensnare Tally. He took a daring measure by equipping the suspect's boyfriend with a concealed recording device, known as a police wire. In this way, whatever Tally said during their interactions would be captured and documented for the detectives to examine. Meanwhile, Perkins decided to circulate a false story regarding Elizabeth's murder with a local journalist. This calculated move aimed to provoke reactions from Tally, potentially revealing new clues or insights into the case. Once the fabricated news about Elizabeth's murder was published, Perkins ensured it came to Tally's notice. Perkins understood that Tally might panic and err in an effort to protect himself, which would yield valuable information for the inquiry. He visited Tally's apartment and presented him with the newspaper headline. Perkins intended for Tally to feel the pressure and immediacy of the situation. He made certain Tally comprehended that the investigation into Elizabeth's murder was far from concluded. He reassured Tally that the case had not been forgotten and that authorities were actively pursuing the killer. Perkins stressed that the inquiry had been reactivated and encouraged Tally to provide any new details he might possess. This meeting intensified the investigation as detectives observed how Tally would respond under the pressure. After Perkins left, Tally's boyfriend opted to take action himself. He began pressing Tally for answers about Elizabeth, bombarding him with questions. He was resolved to uncover the truth, and this time was unafraid to confront Tally regarding his role in Elizabeth's murder. Despite Tally's effort to maintain composure, he committed a critical error. When his boyfriend inquired about how he knew Elizabeth, Tally, caught unprepared, faltered and inadvertently disclosed all the information. This misstep became the turning point in the inquiry, as Tally's unintentional confession provided the breakthrough detectives had awaited, despite already having amassed considerable evidence implicating Tally as the main suspect. Authorities refrained from arresting him for Elizabeth's murder until they had conclusive proof directly linking him to the offense. Elizabeth had suffered multiple injuries to her head and face during the assault that took her life. These wounds offered important forensic evidence, yet were insufficient to definitively connect Tally to the crime. During the initial investigation at the scene, a large quantity of blood was found, and initially, investigators assumed it all belonged to Elizabeth, so it was not tested. However, on November 23, 2002, DNA analysis expert Bob Scanlon was assigned to re-examine the evidence, concentrating specifically on all items directly associated with the murder. This indicated that Scanlon would inspect the blood recovered at the scene to determine whether a second source of DNA existed. He was directed to meticulously retest all items from the crime scene, as they might contain crucial evidence against the killer. One item of special significance was a silk scarf discovered wrapped around the victim's neck. Scanlon carefully collected samples from every part of the scarf. Upon examination, he found that the majority of the DNA belonged to the victim, but there was also unidentified DNA present on the scarf. After extensive testing, it was established that Tally was indeed the one who murdered Elizabeth on the night of November 3, 1994. Equipped with this forensic proof, Scanlon was ready to establish the connection between Tally and the crime. In December 2002, detectives brought Tally in for questioning. However, persuading Tally to confess proved a difficult challenge for the detectives, as he consistently denied any involvement in the murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Tally remained resolute in refusing to admit guilt. The detectives made a deliberate effort to elicit a confession from Tally during the interview. They presented all the gathered evidence and recounted the specifics of Elizabeth's murder, aiming to trigger his memory. Despite their attempts, Tally remained silent throughout the interrogation and refused to acknowledge any participation in the crime. It did not take long for detectives to uncover the actual motive behind Tally's shocking actions. On the night Elizabeth was tragically killed, she had been seen at a bar with another man, who was none other than Tally's boyfriend. This knowledge stirred a combination of anger and jealousy within Tally. The fear of losing his boyfriend overwhelmed him, and he could not rid himself of that feeling. Ultimately, he followed Elizabeth to her residence, and in a moment of intense emotion and rage, seized the opportunity to commit the crime. Despite all the evidence against him and ongoing questioning by detectives, Tally never faced a jury trial. Instead, he opted to enter an Alfred plea. This meant that while he did not admit guilt, he acknowledged that the state possessed sufficient evidence to convict him. Consequently, in 2004, Tally was sentenced to 80 years in prison, the same term he would have received if he had pleaded guilty. In 2016, however, Tally died at the age of 58 while serving his sentence. This case stands as a stark reminder of how a single wrong decision can have catastrophic consequences, not only for oneself, but also for many others involved. What are your thoughts on this case? What might have driven Tally to kill Elizabeth? Was it a tragic error, or were darker motives involved? What does it reveal about the repercussions of impulsive decisions? Moving on to the next case. Regina Hicks. In October 2001, a 25-year-old woman disappeared after departing from her boyfriend's home in Willard. Despite years spent funding billboards and pursuing leads in an unyielding search for answers, a breakthrough would not occur until more than 20 years later. Regina Hicks was born on September 13, 1976 in Norwalk, Huron County, Ohio, to Lakella and Raleigh Rowe. She was raised in the nearby town of Willard. She belonged to the Veterans of Foreign Wars in Willard and actively took part in community events. As a young adult, she wed Paul Hicks, and the pair had one son, Montana Hicks. Although the marriage started with promise, it ultimately fell apart. By 2001, Regina and Paul were separated. In spite of the marital difficulties, Regina remained a dedicated mother, always placing her son's needs above her own, even when she began a new relationship. On the evening of October 18, 2001, 25-year-old Regina was last observed leaving her boyfriend's home around 8 p.m. in her white Chevrolet Camaro. She told him she was going to pick up her son. Tragically, she never reached her destination. Concern quickly spread among her loved ones, who sensed something was terribly wrong. Her family initiated a frantic search. At the time, Paul, her estranged husband, placed a chilling call to Chad Rowe, Regina's brother, saying ominously, "They think she's in the pond." That statement would later arouse serious suspicions. The police were informed, but jurisdictional confusion between Willard Police and the Huron County Sheriff's Office created immediate difficulties. Chad later criticized the initial handling of the case, stating that officials dropped the ball during the most critical moments of the investigation. As days went by with no word from Regina, anxiety shifted to dread. Family, friends, and the community desperately prayed for a miracle. But what followed would confirm their worst fears. On October 22nd, 4 days after she disappeared, Regina's white Camaro was found submerged in a pond near section Line Road 30 in Willard. Inside the vehicle, in the passenger seat, was Regina's lifeless body. An autopsy revealed bruising on her head, indicating foul play. Authorities then ruled out the case as an accident. From the outset, the case was plagued with issues. Confusion over jurisdiction, mishandling of the scene, and slow progress hindered the investigation. Still, Regina's mother, Lakella Holbrook, refused to accept silence as the outcome. For more than a decade, she devoted her heart and finances to the pursuit of justice, paying for billboards, offering a $20,000 reward, placing newspaper advertisements, and even interviewing potential witnesses. Lacella's efforts were courageous, but they came at a cost. The emotional weight and physical strain eventually led to her declining health. She was diagnosed with cancer and died without witnessing her daughter's perpetrator brought to justice. Despite the emotional exhaustion, Chad kept his sister's memory alive. He never stopped seeking answers, never stopped demanding accountability. In 2024, after more than 2 decades, renewed hope appeared in the form of Ashley Ford, a community activist and podcaster recognized for her work on cold cases. With the Rowe family's blessing, Ford began creating episodes about Regina's unsolved case, examining old evidence, reviewing Lacella's notes, and reaching out to local authorities. Ford's podcast drew public attention and rekindled interest in the case. She handled the investigation with a mother's compassion and a journalist's determination. Her episode resonated with listeners, and soon the case was no longer merely a local tragedy. It became a representation of community-driven justice. Ford said, "Reading through the mom's notes is so hard. To know she passed away never getting justice, and she was so close, I started where she stopped." After Ford's coverage, agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation met with Chad, something they had not done in years. That visit marked a pivotal moment. It seemed the wheels of justice were finally moving once more. Chad voiced cautious optimism, stating, "I am hoping within the next year or so we can get it all solved and get the right people that need to be in jail. On April 23, 2025, nearly 24 years after the case had been opened, the long-awaited breakthrough arrived. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost and Huron County Prosecutor James Sitterly announced that 50-year-old Paul Hicks, residing in Sandusky, had been indicted on 3 counts of slaying and 1 count of kidnapping. He was taken into custody by agents from BCI and the U.S. Marshals Service in Seneca County. He was no stranger to criminal accusations. In 2019, he had surrendered after being sought for 4 years in connection with an elaborate arson scheme in which he attempted to have his own home set on fire. Before the fire, cameras recorded 2 individuals entering the house carrying gas cans. They can be seen removing 2 large TVs and pouring accelerant inside the residence. Hicks attempted to blame the fire on his ex-girlfriend and identified her in the footage. He went to great lengths to frame her. He had another woman purchase a custom mask from a company called That's My Face and had her obtain a wig that matched his ex's hair. Hicks also acquired a video surveillance system and secured the recording device inside a fireproof box so that the alleged evidence would endure. Investigators questioned the ex-girlfriend, but she was cleared. In 2019, Hicks was indicted on charges of aggravated arson, perjury, and insurance fraud. The case proceeded through years of court appearances and postponements. Ultimately, Hicks accepted a plea deal, pleading no contest, and was found guilty of a misdemeanor insurance fraud charge. He was sentenced to community control. Civilly, however, Allstate prevailed in its case, and Hicks agreed to pay $400,000 to the insurance company. These prior allegations depicted a troubling portrait of Hicks' past and character. During a press conference, Attorney General Yost said, "Now it is up to us to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law." Although the legal process is anticipated to be lengthy, for Chad and the memory of his mother, Lakella, the arrest of Paul Hicks represents a long-overdue first step toward achieving justice for Regina. The investigation continues, and authorities persist in urging anyone with information to come forward. Attorney General Dave Yost said, And now it is up to us to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt beyond a court of law. Hicks was arraigned, and he entered a plea of not guilty. His bond was set at $2 million. Moving on to the next case. Shirley Brandt. In June 1986, a peaceful afternoon in North Miami Beach, Florida became deadly. The victim's last words were, "Do not shoot." For almost 4 decades, the case stayed unsolved until a breakthrough occurred. Shirley Brandt was born on June 14, 1936, and was raised in Florida. During the 1960s, she followed a path in entertainment, performing as a singer on cruise ships together with her sister. The glow of stage lights and the sound of applause signaled the start of Shirley's professional path. However, by the early 1970s, she redirected her attention to real estate. She started her real estate career by selling residential properties. It did not take long before Shirley aimed higher, moving into commercial real estate. Outside of her profession, Shirley was dedicated to her family and her community. She was married to Dr. Brandt, a prominent dentist in their area, and together they raised 4 children. She actively took part in charitable initiatives, particularly those aiding Soviet Jews during the Refusnik movement. On June 13, 1986, everything shifted. Shirley was working in her second-story office at Brandt Realty Corporation, situated on Northeast 18th Avenue. She was on the phone speaking with a friend, while a co-worker nearby was quietly concentrating on entering data into a computer. According to police, 2 men entered the office without warning. One of them immediately became aggressive, insisting that Shirley hang up the phone. The authorities would later characterize the event as an attempted robbery. But when Shirley refused and began screaming, the man reacted with deadly force. In spite of her desperate final words, "Do not shoot," he discharged a shot directly at her face. The phone receiver was torn from the landline base and left beneath her desk as both men fled. Emergency responders rushed Shirley to Parkway Regional Hospital, but the harm was irreversible. She passed away from her injuries shortly after arriving. The autopsy verified that Shirley's life was taken by the single gunshot wound to the head. Investigators moved quickly, gathering fingerprints from around the scene, including prints on the phone discovered under Shirley's desk. However, despite this evidence, the case started to fall apart. For reasons that remain unknown even decades later, the prints were never submitted to the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, a database that might have assisted in identifying a suspect early on. It was a crucial opportunity missed in the quest for justice for Shirley. At the time of the shooting, a witness inside the office described the 2 suspects as well-dressed. Both men were observed wearing dress pants and long-sleeve collared shirts. Investigators believe that this intentional choice of clothing may have been a strategy to appear professional and avoid attracting attention to themselves. After the shooting, the suspects did not simply run from the scene. They took cash and credit cards with them, adding theft to the violence they had already carried out. In a desperate effort to obtain answers, Shirley's family offered a $25,000 reward for information, leading to the arrest of the man responsible for the shooting. The weapon was described as a small-caliber firearm, but beyond that, there were no firm leads. With no arrests, no suspects, and no additional developments, the investigation eventually lost momentum. Time went by, and the trail became cold. But in January 2023, nearly 37 years after the crime occurred, the North Miami Beach Police Department established a new cold case unit to examine unsolved cases. Investigators revisited Shirley's case and located the original fingerprints gathered from the crime scene. These prints were resubmitted using updated forensic technology. On March 21, 2025, the breakthrough finally arrived. A match was identified. The fingerprints were connected to 64-year-old Jeffrey Taylor. He was arrested on April 24, 2025, and charged in the 2nd degree with using a firearm. Taylor was booked into the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center in Miami, where he remains held without bond. Shirley's son, Ben Brandt, spoke at a press conference outside the North Miami Beach Police headquarters, describing his mother as a pioneer who broke barriers and gave generously to charitable causes. In the weeks after Shirley's death in 1986, her husband transformed grief into action. He founded the Shirley Brandt Memorial Fund Against Handgun Crime, intended to confront the growing danger of gun violence. He stated at the time, "People have been calling and asking, 'What can I do?' What they can do is vote for elected officials who want to take action on gun control. He also offered a pointed reply to the NRA's slogan, saying, "Guns do not end people's lives. People with guns end people's lives." Dr. Lawrence Brandt remained committed to that cause until his death in 2016. North Miami Beach Police Chief Juan Panillos emphasized the significance of the development, stating, "The resolution of this case demonstrates our department's dedication to justice, no matter how much time has gone by." While Taylor's arrest represents a significant milestone, the investigation is still ongoing. Authorities continue to look for the second man who was present during the attempted robbery, as the pursuit of full accountability in Shirley's case continues forward. Moving on to the next case. Tanya and Jay, hailing from Victoria in British Columbia. 20-year-old Jay and 18-year-old Tanya were a young couple full of love and curiosity. In November 1987, they set out on a simple getaway, planning to return the following day. But what began as a journey of love and joy quickly turned into a nightmare of unimaginable horror. Tanya and Jay never came home and were reported missing. Nearly a week later, when Tanya's body was discovered in a horrifying state, the mystery behind her tragic fate began to unravel. And while Tanya had been found, there were still no signs of Jay. Who could have committed such a brutal act? Could Jay have done it and then fled to an unknown location? If not, where was he? And who was the monster responsible for Tanya's merciless murder? Tanya Van Quillenborg, or Sweetie as her loved ones called her, was born on March 7, 1969, to Jean Lorraine and Willem Van Quillenborg. Tanya and her older brother, John, grew up in their hometown of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, and had a childhood filled with love and affection. Tanya's loyal companion growing up was the family dog, Tessa, a golden retriever. Because of Tessa, Tanya developed a fondness for animals and a desire to contribute to their well-being. By 1987, after graduating high school, Tanya had been considering a career as a veterinarian. By this time, she had also met her boyfriend, Jay Roland Cook, a senior at her school. Jay was born on December 16, 1966, to Leona and Gordon. Like Tanya, Jay also grew up in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, with his sister Laura. He was a quiet and calm individual, often mistaken for being shy. By November 1987, 20-year-old Jay and 18-year-old Tanya had been together for about 6 months. For Jay's mother, Leona, the joy on Jay's face when he was with Tanya was enough to show that Tanya was special to him. For Tanya's father, Willem, Tanya's happiness was all that mattered. Sadly, neither of the happy families had any idea of the tragedy that was about to strike. On Wednesday, November 18, 1987, Jay and Tanya had planned to run an errand for Jay's father, Gordon. However, it was not going to be a brief task. Gordon ran a business and needed furnace parts, which had to be collected from Seattle, Washington State, USA. Seeing this as an opportunity for his first trip with his girlfriend and to spend more time with her, Jay invited Tanya to join him. Tanya was equally enthusiastic. She had recently developed an interest in photography and had purchased a camera. She took her camera and accompanied Jay, intending to capture the beautiful moments of their romantic getaway. A little past noon on November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay departed in Jay's father's bronze 1977 Ford Club van. Their plan was to take a ferry from Victoria, British Columbia, to Washington State, drive to the store in Seattle, and pick up the furnace parts Jay's father had asked him to collect. Because it would be a lengthy journey, Jay and Tanya planned to spend the night in Seattle before returning home the next day. On Thursday, November 19, 1987, their families waited for their return, expecting them around noon. But as the time passed with no sign of the couple, fear began to take hold. Though young, Tanya and Jay were responsible, and it was unlike them not to call if plans changed or they were going to be late. Tanya's mother, Jean, sensed that something was wrong, and although Tanya's father tried to reassure her, he shared the same concern. Sadly, as the sun neared the horizon on the evening of November 19, 1987, with the couple still absent, both families contacted the Victoria Police Department to report them missing. John, Tanya's brother, was at college when he received news of his sister's disappearance. He rushed home to help his family search for Tanya and Jay. Detectives from the British Columbia Police Department took on the case, and with assistance from the Washington State Police Department, they traced Tanya and Jay's movements from the day they crossed the border. According to detectives, Tanya and Jay boarded the 4 p.m. car ferry from Victoria, which was a 90-minute journey, arriving at Port Angeles, Washington State. By 5:30 p.m. witnesses reported seeing Tanya and Jay heading south on Highway 101. They were spotted in Hoodsport around 8 p.m., and again in Allen about an hour later. Detectives believed they were heading to Bremerton to catch another ferry at 10:20 p.m., which would take them to Seattle. Upon arriving in Seattle, they planned to park the van near the Kingdom and spend the night there. Tragically, from that point forward, there were no further traces of Tanya and Jay. Days passed without any sign of them. Then, on Wednesday, November 24, 1987, the worst fears were realized. About 80 miles from Seattle, a partially clothed woman's body was found in a ditch alongside the isolated Parsons Creek Road, near Algier and Burlington in Skagit County, Washington State. Though detectives were confident it was Tanya, they summoned her brother John, who confirmed the identification. The state of Tanya's body told a horrific story, indicating that she had endured extreme suffering in her final moments. She was not wearing any pants or any underwear, and her bra had been pushed up to her shoulders, exposing her breasts. Tanya had been, and then shot in the back of her head at close range with a .38 caliber firearm. Traces of a foreign bodily fluid were discovered on Tanya's body. Additionally, detectives found some plastic zip ties lying along the road near the body. Detectives believe the zip ties had been used to restrain her in the van and transport her to the crime scene. Detectives informed both families that there was a possibility that Jay carried out the brutal assault and murder and then fled the area. They warned them to be prepared for this bitter possibility, as Jay was now considered a suspect in Tanya's murder. However, neither Jay's family nor Tanya's family believed that Jay would commit such an act. Just the next day, on November 25, 1987, detectives located Jay's van near a bus station in Bellingham, 14 miles from where Tanya's body had been found. Upon searching the van, they discovered a Bremerton-Seattle ferry ticket, additional zip ties, a pair of black pants belonging to Tanya, and a comforter covered in blood stains. More traces of a foreign bodily fluid were found on Tanya's pants and on the zip ties in the van. Detectives also discovered a palm print on the rear door of the van. At that stage, detectives were unsure whether Jay had actually committed the crime or if another person was involved. However, based on the evidence at hand, they grew increasingly concerned that Jay might also have been a victim of foul play. Later that same day, November 25, 1987, investigators found more zip ties beneath the porch of a tavern just 2 blocks from the van. They also found keys to Jay's van, Tanya's driver's license and wallet, and a half-empty box of ammunition. Unsurprisingly, the bullets in the box matched the one that killed Tanya. Among the new evidence, detectives also found a pair of plastic surgical gloves. Detectives believed the killer had deliberately left the gloves as a calling card for law enforcement. The killer wanted detectives to know that, wearing gloves, he had left no fingerprints, signaling that they needed to search carefully. The killer's confidence that he left nothing at the scene linking him to the crime appeared to be a taunt to the detectives. The hopes of Jay's family to find him alive hung by a thread, but those hopes were crushed on Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1987, when Jay's body was discovered beneath Highbridge off Crescent Lake Road near Monroe, Washington, approximately 70 miles from where Tanya had been found. Jay's body had been covered with a blue blanket, likely to conceal the brutality he had suffered before death. He had been beaten with rocks and strangled using twine and 2 red dog collars. His hands were bound with zip ties, and tissues along with a pack of cigarettes had been forced into his mouth. Based on the condition of Jay's body and the evidence discovered, detectives believed the manner of his murder resembled the abuse patterns they had seen previously behind prison walls. The measures taken to conceal Jay's identity indicated familiarity with police procedures. This led detectives to suspect that whoever murdered Jay might have previously spent time in prison. Interestingly, Jay's body was found near the Monroe Honor Farm, a men's prison that was the second largest in the state, prompting detectives to consider whether it was a clue or coincidence. Determined to leave no possibility unexplored, they investigated the prison theory, but it ultimately led to a dead end. As the investigation continued in full force, it became time for Jay and Tanya's loved ones to say their final farewells. A funeral service was held for Tanya, and she was laid to rest at Ross Bay Cemetery in Victoria, British Columbia. Shortly thereafter, Jay was cremated, and his remains were scattered at Fulford Harbor on Salt Spring Island. Although the identity of Tanya and Jay's killer remained unknown, detectives had gathered sufficient evidence to reconstruct the events of November 18, 1987, when Tanya and Jay arrived in Washington state. Detectives believed there was a strong likelihood that Tanya and Jay drew the attention of their killer during the 10 to 20 p.m. ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. Observing Tanya and Jay as a friendly, young couple traveling alone, the killer likely perceived them as easy targets. The killer likely made his initial contact with the couple in the ferry lounge and became acquainted with them, probably after giving a false introduction. Unaware of his true intentions, Tanya and Jay may have engaged in a friendly conversation with him. Detectives believe the killer may have asked Tanya and Jay for a ride across Puget Sound. By the time they disembarked in downtown Seattle, they were already in the company of the killer. Exploiting Tanya and Jay's innocence, the killer deceived them into giving him a ride. Once he led them to an isolated location, he put his plan into motion. The killer had targeted Tanya from the moment he saw her on the ferry. He intended to assault her, but Jay was an obstacle. Detectives believe he killed Jay first, then took Tanya to another location where he assaulted and murdered her. Afterwards, he abandoned the van and disposed of the evidence. Since tools such as zip ties, a gun, gloves, and other items had been used in the crimes, detectives were convinced that whoever killed Tanya and Jay came equipped with a kill kit. His purpose was to inflict harm, seeking prey deliberately. Detectives also believe the killer was familiar with the Washington area where the bodies and van were discovered. Furthermore, examining the manner in which Tanya and Jay were killed, detectives believe the killer had likely committed similar offenses previously. He appeared experienced and knowledgeable in his actions. Concerned by this, detectives feared he would continue committing such crimes until apprehended. Having successfully eluded justice, as long as he remained free, he posed a threat to society. There is an old adage among detectives that every killer makes at least one mistake. Although the killer seemed confident he left nothing behind to incriminate him, he was mistaken. On the day Jay and Tanya left for their romantic trip, Jay wore a waist-length black ski jacket with red piping on the sleeves. That jacket was never recovered at any crime scene. Tanya's olive drab daypack and her Minolta 35mm camera, serial number 206-7048, were also never found. Detectives therefore believed the killer might have taken these items, which could aid in tracking him. Information about the missing possessions was circulated throughout Washington state in hopes that someone might spot him with the items and alert authorities. Unfortunately, no such sightings were ever reported. Detectives also considered the possibility that these murders were connected to those of several other couples in the region, but that led to a dead end as well. While detectives worked on the double homicide, every day was agonizing for Jay and Tanya's families, who struggled with the grief of losing loved ones with their whole lives ahead. As both families attempted to put the tragedies behind them and move on, someone committed an unthinkable act, adding insult to injury. Just 2 weeks after Tanya and Jay were murdered, their families began receiving threatening letters and morbid greeting cards during the first week of December 1987. The frequency of these letters increased around the Christmas season. The letters described the murders in a taunting manner, with the author claiming full responsibility, intensifying the family's pain. The writer also stated that he harbored a deep hatred for Canadians and that the chance to kill Tanya and Jay was too good to pass up. Furthermore, he threatened the detectives, claiming he would kill again and boasting that he would never be caught. Over the following year, Tanya and Jay's families received numerous letters, 19 mailed over 3 separate holidays. As before, all letters contained anti-Canadian remarks and cruel language. The first 2 letters arrived on December 3, 1987, postmarked from Seattle. Approximately a dozen more arrived each month for a year. The writer used Hallmark greeting cards depicting teddy bears and kittens for Father's Day, Mother's Day, and Christmas. He also sent letters to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a British Columbia newspaper. In every letter, the author claimed responsibility for the murders. All cards and letters were penned by the same individual and were occasionally signed Tanya or Jay. Although detectives noted the letters were postmarked from New York, Los Angeles, and Seattle, the author's identity and address remained entirely unknown. Nevertheless, detectives remained hopeful of uncovering who was behind these tormenting correspondence. However, detectives did notice some unusual details in those letters that were noteworthy. The handwriting on the cards was highly distinctive. The author also repeatedly used certain specific phrases. Phrases such as hallelujah, bloody Jesus, and greetings and salutations appeared to be the author's favorites. At that time, police did not find anything in the letters that would definitively prove the author was the killer. In that regard, the letters did not contain any details that had not already been released to the public. Detectives believed that even if the author was not the killer, he might still have been involved in the crime and connected in some way to Tanya and Jay. And despite detectives pursuing him, he continued to harass Jay's and Tanya's families. Examining the letters did help detectives narrow their list of suspects. There was also a possibility that the writer was Canadian. This suspicion arose because the letters exhibited specific grammar and punctuation patterns, indicating the author may have been educated in Canada. Despite these observations, there remained a significant lack of evidence in the case. Detectives only hoped that the killer might confide in someone, and that someday those people would come forward to help identify him. 3 years after Tanya and Jay's murders, a small development occurred in the case, giving detectives hope that they were inching closer to apprehending the killer. In 1990, detectives were able to locate the camera lens from Tanya's missing camera at a pawn shop in Portland, Oregon. However, the lens had been transferred to that pawn shop from another shop, and unfortunately, that original shop had no records from the time the lens was first brought in. Consequently, detectives were unable to determine who initially pawned the lens. Observing the extremely slow progress of the case and hoping to gather more information, Tanya's family offered a $50,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the killer. Detectives did receive a few tips, but none led anywhere. DNA samples from Tanya's body and pants, the zip ties, and the threatening letters were preserved for future reference. With no new developments or potential suspects, the case of Tanya and Jay's brutal murders joined the ranks of many other cold cases. In 1995, Detective Jim Scharf from Snohomish County assembled a cold case team consisting of top-tier detectives, and Tanya and Jay's case drew their attention. Reviewing the violent and merciless nature of the crime, it became one of the team's first cases. This new team began reviewing the case files and re-examining all evidence collected during the original investigation. Over the next several years, detectives developed multiple theories, followed numerous leads, and questioned several potential suspects. None of these efforts yielded results. According to Detective Scharf, more than 200 names passed across his desk, some of them convicted felons, but none could be linked to Tanya and Jay's murders. There were no further developments until 2003. With advances in DNA technology, detectives decided to try again. A DNA sample from bodily fluids on Tanya, her pants, and the zip ties was examined, and a DNA profile of the suspect was created. The Washington State Patrol designated it as Individual A's profile and uploaded it to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database for offenders. However, the profile did not match anyone. Serial killers active in the Seattle area in 1987, such as Robert Yates and Charles Sinclair, were also questioned, but the DNA evidence cleared them of involvement. Once again, the investigation stalled. About 7 years later, in August 2010, scientists at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in Marysville informed detectives that they had successfully collected DNA samples from the threatening letters Tanya and Jay's families had received nearly 23 years earlier. Later, when these samples were analyzed, the scientists made a shocking discovery. The DNA found on the letters did not match the samples collected from Tanya's body, clothing, and zip ties at the crime scene. This led detectives to consider the possibility that multiple individuals were involved in the double homicide. Armed with this new finding, detectives sought assistance from the well-known TV station Q13 Fox. The station subsequently featured Tanya and Jay's case with fresh updates twice on their popular local show, Washington's Most Wanted, which had already aided in capturing 144 fugitives. Soon after, detectives began receiving tips from viewers of the program. Victoria cold case detectives were finally able to identify the author of the threatening letters and trace him to Seattle. The man was arrested at Seattle's public library during a sting operation conducted by detectives. At the time of his identification, the man was in his 70s and a Canadian citizen. Upon further investigation into his life, detectives discovered that he suffered from severe mental health issues. He had grown up in several Canadian foster homes and endured abuse throughout his childhood. Likely as a result, he experienced difficulties in his professional life and harbored resentment toward fellow Canadians. When detectives confronted him about his cruel actions toward Tanya and Jay's families, he made no attempt to deny them. In fact, he openly admitted to writing the offensive letters. Detectives interviewed him for several hours and ultimately concluded that he had no involvement in the murders of Tanya and Jay. He had no connection to the actual perpetrator and possessed no knowledge of the murders beyond what had already been publicly reported. Because the statute of limitations for harassment was 3 years, he could not be charged for sending the letters and was released. 8 more years passed, and Tanya and Jay's killer remained at large. Things changed when Joseph James D'Angelo, responsible for numerous assaults and murders and known as the Golden State Killer, was identified after evading law enforcement for nearly 43 years. Joseph was identified using genetic genealogy and was arrested on April 25, 2018 in California. Inspired by this breakthrough, Detective Scharf realized that genetic genealogy could be a powerful tool in solving cold cases like Tanya and Jay's, even though the technology was relatively new at the time. It appeared to be the most reliable option available. Detective Scharf presented the case to scientists at Parabon Nanolabs. After detailed discussion, the lab decided to upload individual A's DNA profile to GEDmatch on April 27, 2018. Shortly thereafter, Snohomish County detectives released a Parabon DNA snapshot composite of the killer, created from the DNA evidence. These composites included predictions of what the suspect might have looked like at ages 25, 45, and 65, based on Parabon analysis. It was believed that the suspect was a Caucasian male of European descent, with hazel or green eyes, fair skin, possible freckles, and likely male pattern baldness. Once individual A's DNA had been uploaded, genetic genealogist Cece Moore was brought in to work on the case. She had been following Tanya and Jay's case for years and felt a personal connection, watching how 2 young, innocent lives had been cut short. Genealogist Cece Moore logged onto GEDmatch to analyze individual A's DNA and search for potential matches. Soon, she identified 2 profiles that shared enough DNA with individual A to be his second cousins. In this instance, the cousins shared DNA with individual A, but not with each other, indicating they were related to him through separate branches of his family tree. To determine individual A's identity, Cece needed to construct a family tree using the 2 profiles most likely to be the suspect's second cousins. The second profile belonged to a woman named Chelsea Rustad. In 2015, Chelsea Rustad, a resident of Tumwater, Washington, had uploaded her DNA to a public database hoping to explore her family tree and discover additional relatives. Although Chelsea was not related to Jay or Tanya, she had never imagined that this process would eventually lead cold case detectives to her doorstep, and that her DNA would help solve the mystery of who killed Tanya and Jay. Equipped with all necessary information, Cece built the family trees for the 2 top matches and soon traced where and how they converged. Within just 2 hours, she examined the resulting tree and identified the person she believed was the killer of Tanya and Jay. Cece identified individual A as William Earl Talbot II. For the first time in 31 years, there was a name and face attached to the suspect whose identity had remained unknown. Upon hearing the name, Detective Jim Scharf checked the system for any records and was surprised to discover that Talbot had no prior felony convictions. This was an individual who had evaded capture for over 3 decades, and using the power of genetic genealogy, Cece identified him in just 2 hours. She did not want to waste a moment after identifying Talbot and was determined to learn more about him and his whereabouts. She had already begun searching online for information about Talbot, but found almost nothing. There were no records of marriages or children. Years earlier, in 2013, Chelsea Rustad had traced Talbot's sisters and father on social media, who were unaware of the Tanya and Jay investigation. Around 2 years before submitting her DNA to public websites, Chelsea had Googled her grandfather's sister, Blanche, and found substantial information about her and her family online. Blanche's daughter was Patty Talbot, who had 3 daughters and 1 son, the son being William Earl Talbot. The Talbots were Chelsea's second cousins. Chelsea connected with the 2 sisters via Facebook, but their brother William remained a mystery even after she uploaded her DNA to Ancestry.com and GEDmatch in 2015. She assumed William Talbot was estranged from his family and did not think much of it. When investigators appeared at her doorstep in 2018, she was completely shocked. Once Detective Scharf learned about Talbot's family members, he began interviewing all of them and speaking with Talbot's friends. Through these interviews, Detective Scharf uncovered additional details about Talbot's past. In audio-recorded interviews with Talbot's sisters, he learned that Talbot had a history of anger and violence. He had been a troubled child, carrying those traits into his teens and young adulthood. In the mid-1970s, when Talbot was only 11, his father suffered a serious motorcycle accident, yet Talbot continued to lash out during the family crisis. He frequently engaged in heated arguments with his sisters, causing them physical and emotional harm. As he grew older and stronger, the beatings intensified, leaving his sisters nearly defenseless against him. One of Talbot's sisters even said that he beat her up so badly one time that her tailbone broke, and she had to be admitted to the hospital. Even while each of his sisters confirmed that Talbot was a violent person, they also felt he would not go to the extent to assault and murder someone. Detectives had enough evidence to know that they were following the correct lead, and given Talbot's violent past, his actions were sitting well with the details of Jay and Tanya's case. All that the detectives needed now was to make an arrest. However, that wasn't going to be very easy. To make an arrest, Detective Scharf needed to confirm that the DNA found on Tanya's body and pants at the crime scene belonged to Talbot. Investigators found out that Talbot used to drive a truck and was a resident of Seattle. Detectives decided to tail him for a few days, looking for opportunities to collect his DNA. And on May 8, 2018, he dropped a cup from the window of his truck and drove away. Detectives quickly collected the cup as evidence and rushed to the Washington State Patrol lab that same day. While the detectives awaited the results, scientists at the lab tested the DNA sample from the cup against the sample of individual A. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins confirmed that the DNA on Talbot's cup was a perfect match to that of individual A and broke the news to Detective Scharf after reaching dozens of dead ends and following hundreds of leads for more than 30 years. On May 17, 2018, then 55-year-old William Earl Talbot, too, was finally arrested and taken into custody in Seattle. The first call Detective Scharf made after the arrest was to Tanya's older brother, John Van Queilenborg. John was also present at the press conference on May 18, 2018, when Jim Scharf and the other detectives made the announcement of Talbot's arrest. John said the information about his little sister's killer being finally caught after 31 years sent a chill down his spine. He described it as an overwhelming feeling. Jay's sister, Laura, and mother, Leona, attended the conference as well. Laura said that it was a feeling of mixed emotions. On a similar note, Leona described it as a bittersweet feeling. On one hand, she was happy to gain some form of closure, but on the other, she still didn't have her only son and nothing could bring him back. Although Talbot's DNA was a match to the foreign bodily fluids found on Tanya, her pants, and on the zip ties, detectives conducted another test and confirmed that the palm print found on the back door of the van Jay and Tanya were traveling in was also a match to Talbot. Talbot was initially charged only with first-degree murder of Tanya Van Queilenborg. However, nearly a month after his arrest on May 17, 2018, he was also charged with first-degree murder of Jay Roland Cook. On June 16, 2018, Talbot claimed that he was innocent and pleaded not guilty at a preliminary hearing. Detectives found out that when the murders were committed, Talbot was 24 years old and lived in Woodinville from 1984 to 1993. His house was only 7 miles from where Jay's body was found. In 1987, Talbot was working as a delivery driver and made regular stops in the area where Jay and Tanya were headed to pick up the furnace parts. Additionally, detectives also learned that Talbot was fired after a few months before he committed the murders. Talbot's former roommate, too, came forward to inform the detectives that he had seen a blue blanket in his home and in Talbot's car. It was similar to the one found on Jay's body at the crime scene. The roommate also confirmed that Talbot had a difficult relationship with his relatives, particularly with his sisters. He added that Talbot was involved in drugs and had personality changes whenever he was under the influence of alcohol. He also recalled seeing a bronze van resembling the one Jay and Tanya were traveling in outside of his home on a misty day in the fall of 1987. Finally, he recalled that Talbot would often take him to the same area where Jay's body was later found. Facing 2 charges of first-degree murder in the case of Tanya and Jay, Talbot was held on $2.5 million of bail. On Tuesday, June 11, 2019, Talbot went on trial for Jay and Tanya's murders. He pleaded not guilty to both the charges before the trial could even begin. There was a slight complication. One of the jurors, Juror 40 in particular, told both the state and the defense that as a child, she had witnessed her mother go through a lot of domestic abuse. She couldn't say for sure whether her personal experiences in life would affect her decisions in the trial until the time came. But before the defense and state agreed to move ahead with the trial, Juror 40 promised to give her very best in the trial. In the court, Talbot was being represented by attorney Rachel Forte with John Scott, acting as her co-counsel. Rachel and John argued that there was an actual innocent explanation for Talbot's DNA ending up on Tanya's body and pants. Talbot's defense claimed that Talbot did have a sensual encounter with Tanya, but it was fully consensual. Additionally, the defense claimed that both Tanya and Jay were killed by someone else. The prosecution countered these claims and highlighted that it would not make sense for Tanya to indulge in any kind of activity with Talbot, since she was with Jay, her boyfriend, in a foreign country, and also on her menstrual period at the time. Rachel's co-counsel, John Scott, said there was not enough evidence to prove Talbot guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He pointed out that Tanya and Jay had been missing for several days before their bodies were discovered, which implied that the couple must have come across their actual killer much later on. In addition to that, Talbot's lawyer said the detectives were unable to link Talbot to the type of gun that had been used to kill Tanya. Neither were they able to link Talbot to the pack of cigarettes that had been stuffed in Jay's mouth, and nor to the red-colored dog collars used to strangle Jay. Deputy Prosecutor Matt Baldock said that if Talbot's DNA being found on Tanya's body and her clothes was not enough to prove Talbot's guilt, then Talbot's DNA being found on the zip ties and the palm print found on the back of Jay's, then being a perfect match to Talbot, confirmed his involvement in the murders beyond a reasonable doubt. Furthermore, Prosecutor Baldock highlighted the fact that Talbot used to live merely 7 miles from where Jay's body was discovered. Prosecutor Baldock said that this proved the connection between Jay's murder, Tanya's murder, and the van. Towards the end of the trial, defense attorney Rachel Forte argued that Detective Jim Sharp from the cold case team had tunnel vision. Rachel pointed out that Detective Sharp and his team jumped to conclusions, never stopped to consider that perhaps the person who left the DNA was not the murderer. Talbot chose not to take the stand in his defense, and his lawyer seemed pretty confident that the jury would agree and there was not enough evidence to prove Talbot guilty. In their closing arguments, the defense told the jury that police had placed unreasonable emphasis on the DNA evidence. In the prosecution's closing statement, Baldock argued that the only reasonable explanation was that Talbot had overpowered the young couple. He came prepared, planning first to assault Tanya and then kill both her and Jay. Baldock highlighted that Talbot possessed zip ties, gloves, and a gun, demonstrating that the crime was premeditated and that he knew exactly what he was doing. Juror 40, along with 11 other jurors, had been listening to witness testimonies for 2 weeks and began deliberations on June 25, 2019. After 3 days of deliberation, on June 28, 2019, the jury reached a verdict, finding Talbot guilty and convicting him of the murders of 18-year-old Tanya Van Queilenborg and 20-year-old Jay Rolencook. The verdict shocked the defense, who had confidently anticipated a different outcome. Nearly a month later, on July 24, 2019, William Earl Talbot II was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. Jay and Tanya's families were present in the courtroom, along with Chelsea Rustad, the only known relative of Talbot, there to support the victims. Chelsea had never met either Jay or Tanya's families and was anxious about facing them in court. With their blessing, she chose to attend Talbot's sentencing, meeting Tanya's older brother, John, for the first time. More than 2 years later, when Talbot remained behind bars and the case seemed resolved, a controversy emerged. Talbot filed an appeal, claiming his right to an impartial jury had been violated due to a biased juror, Juror 40. As a result, the double murder conviction of William Earl Talbot II was overturned on Monday, December 8, 2021, because the court could not be certain that the juror had been entirely free of bias when deliberating the case. This was the first time the defense had challenged the forensic genealogy. The Division I Court of Appeals in Washington state acknowledged the possibility of error, stating that they could not determine whether Juror 40 was sufficiently unbiased or whether Talbot had been provided a fair jury. This reasoning led to the reversal of Talbot's conviction. Additionally, Talbot and his attorneys raised numerous other issues related to the case evidence, citing supplemental court papers prepared by Talbot himself. Unsurprisingly, this decision angered both the prosecutors and the families of Jay and Tanya. The ruling overturning Talbot's conviction was later appealed to the state's highest court. In September 2022, Chief Justice Stephen Gonzalez noted during oral arguments that Juror 40 had not made any statements demonstrating obvious bias or a clear conflict of interest. The court emphasized that if a party allowed a juror to be seated and did not use all peremptory challenges, they could not later appeal based on a juror being seated improperly. 3 months later, in December 2022, the state Supreme Court reinstated Talbot's murder convictions. The court stated that Talbot's defense attorneys should have dismissed the juror before the trial if they believed she was biased. Since they did not exercise that option during the June 2019 trial, they could not file additional appeals on the same grounds. Since his arrest in 2018, Talbot has remained in custody at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, despite arguments regarding insufficient evidence, alleged inadequacies in the police investigation, and other claimed missteps at trial that were not addressed in the first appellate ruling. Talbot's attorney planned to file another appeal, and since his 2019 conviction, Talbot has maintained his innocence. Chelsea Rustad, Talbot's second cousin, stated that her sympathy was with Jay and Tanya and their families, despite her genetic connection to Talbot. She expressed pride that her DNA had helped bring a ruthless killer to justice, describing her role in the case and her connection to Talbot. Chelsea later wrote a book about her experience, titled Inherited Secrets. Although nothing could bring Tanya and Jay back, Talbot's conviction provided their families with some measure of closure. Jay's mother, Leona, said she still kept one of Jay's old sweaters in her drawer. Tanya's father, William, had passed away on May 14, 1997, at age 62, never living to see his daughter's killer brought to justice. Tanya's mother, Jean, passed away on March 3, 2020, at the age of 87, leaving in peace knowing her daughter's killer would never be free. Both Jean and William were laid to rest at Ross Bay Cemetery, where Tanya was buried. Tanya's gravestone still bears the final lines of a poem she wrote at 17. There is a place that I know of where up above there flies a dove, and slowly as it turns to dawn, she parts her wings, and then she's gone. How do you think Talbot overpowered both Jay and Tanya? Do you believe he acted alone, or might he have had assistance? Is it possible that Talbot had additional victims who were never linked to him? Moving on to the next case. Tracy Hammerberg. On the 15th of 1984, Ozawaik County Sheriff James Johnson received an urgent phone call from a resident on Maple Road in the town of Grafton. The resident was heading out to get the early morning newspaper at 5:45 a.m. when he encountered something unusual lying on his front porch. As he approached closer to investigate further, he noticed the naked body of a young girl who appeared to have been assaulted. The snow had completely covered the body, with her bludgeoned head staining the white snow crimson, marking the brutal fate she had endured. Even the nearby trees and the road were splattered with blood, depicting one of the most cold-blooded crime scenes Wisconsin had witnessed in decades. When police arrived at the scene, the severe weather conditions had already caused the body to reach a pneumonic state, and although it was uncertain whether the young girl could survive, the ferocious extent of the assault was immediately apparent. The resident speculated that the victim might still be alive, so he also contacted emergency services, who declared her dead shortly afterward. She was discovered lying on her back with her arms and legs spread outward. The body was recovered partially naked from the waist down, aside from her socks, which had been partially removed. The jacket, scarf, and sweater she wore were pulled over her head, exposing the entirety of the remaining body. Her face and neck displayed clear bruises, which from a glance could unmistakably be interpreted as signs of severe assault. By the time the rescue team arrived, her hair was matted with blood and brain matter. The right side of her skull showed heavy trauma, likely the cause of death. Detective Frederick Mueller, one of the first officers at the scene, froze in shock. After witnessing the horrifying scene, backup and forensic teams quickly combed the area, collecting primitive evidence. They found tire tracks in the snow, fresh due to the previous night's snowfall, along with blood spatters scattered across the scene. An officer observed a pack of Marlboro cigarettes at the corner, just inches from the victim's body. The girl wore a men's sapphire high school ring, engraved with Bowdoin High 1983 on one side and Glen 83 on the other. Her remaining clothing, jeans, and shoes were discovered nearby. No murder weapon was recovered, leaving nothing to indicate what might have been used in the attack. Her hands were bagged to preserve evidence, and the body was placed on a bed sheet, prepared to be transported to the hospital. The investigation identified the victim as 18-year-old Tracy Lynn Hammerberg. Tracy Lynn Hammerberg was born on March 7, 1966, in Milwaukee, Oregon, the eldest daughter of Judy Clablund and Harlan Hammerberg. She was raised alongside her half-sister, Jennifer Lubecki. The family relocated to Saukville, Wisconsin, in 1976. After moving, she attended the local Port Washington High School and integrated easily with her new peers. The 18-year-old possessed a lively personality that frequently drew attention in social groups. Being popular in school, Tracy maintained a larger circle of friends than most of her peers, which also exposed her to potentially negative influences. She began babysitting neighborhood children to earn extra money, and on the tragic night of December 14, 1984, Tracy Hammerberg left the house she was babysitting at for the last time. The family confirmed her identity through a tattoo on her arm, a red heart pierced by a blue spear. The autopsy revealed dark hair on her body that was not her own. Multiple overlapping skull fractures suggested she had likely been struck with a rounded object. Tracy had severe bruising around her chest below the collarbone, suggesting that someone had stomped on her. The cause of death was possibly blunt trauma, but petechial rashes on her skin indicated manual strangulation, also as a possible cause. Scar tissue near her abdomen clearly showed that she had been physically assaulted. The barbaric nature of the murder dominated the news the following day, appearing on the front pages of all the city's newspapers. Civilians were horrified to their core. Every parent's worst nightmare was unfolding right before their eyes. While police were still searching for possible leads, Judy and Harlan Hammerberg had not filed a missing person report, as they were accustomed to Tracy's lifestyle. She often stayed out late and roamed freely, engaging in drinking and other social gatherings. For this reason, Tracy's disappearance did not alarm anyone in the family until they turned on the news. Tracy's half-sister, Jennifer Lubecki, and other immediate family members first recognized her on live telecasts of major news channels. Tracy's family called the police, stating they had learned about her on the news and confirmed that their daughter had not returned home since the previous day. They identified her by her distinctive red-dyed hair and the tattoo of a heart on her arm with a blue arrow piercing across it. The family also recognized the ring gifted to her by her boyfriend, and Tracy's body was eventually brought home. Investigating further into her background, it was revealed that Tracy often sought trouble in her life. She frequently associated with strangers, some of whom were youths who had served time in juvenile detention and were known troublemakers. But the main question remained how she ended up on the driveway and what exactly occurred on the night of December 14, 1984. Tracy lived with her half-sister and stepfather, fueling a rebellious character, which for her parents was nothing but beyond their control. Police discovered a previously recorded file of Tracy running away from home. She had repeated clashes with her stepfather, causing her to be in and out of the house frequently. A friend disclosed to police that her stepfather had previously made unwanted advances toward her, which explained her erratic behavior. But Tracy was not a quitter. She wanted a better future for herself and planned to move out of state with her boyfriend to North Dakota. Things were finally looking up for Tracy, but the cruel and tragic hand of fate ruined everything in an instant. On December 14th, Tracy was babysitting for a woman named Helen Michaels between 7:20 and 9:45 p.m. She received a call around 10 p.m., asking her to meet at a nearby grocery store. She left the house she was babysitting at after informing Helen over the phone, promising to return the next morning by 7:30 a.m. Tracy walked to Saukville grocery store and met with friends. They drove to Quade's Tavern in Port Washington, where she told the bartender she was heading to a party in Grafton. The friends then went to a house party on Garfield Road in Port Washington, where they played a beer-drinking game called Quarters and smoked marijuana. Her friends offered her a ride home, but she declined, wanting to go on a night stroll. She is believed to have left the party on foot around 12:30 a.m. The walk would have been 3.7 miles along State Highway 33. This was not unusual for her, as she often walked home late at night. The streets of Grafton, where she was found moments later, were infamous for their isolated streets and shady areas, further suggesting that the killer knew the town and was no complete outsider. Detectives received a new source of evidence from a nearby resident, who reported seeing a green pickup truck late at night. The man driving the vehicle was described as being in his late 30s with medium brown hair. He left the car running at the corner of the street for about half an hour before returning and driving away. Sheriff Johnson and his team successfully traced the owner of the truck, who turned out to be a hunter. During interrogation, he confessed that he had noticed another car with squealing wheels and no headlights as he was passing by. He stated that he did not get a clear view of the car, but assumed it to be a station wagon of some sort. Police were tracking the time frame of this car, as a few other witnesses also reported seeing it. Meanwhile, the investigation revealed that Tracy usually smoked menthol cigarettes, further supporting the assumption that the pack of Marlboros found near the body belonged to the killer. Tracy's social circle raised additional challenges, claiming that the number of people on the suspect list was far too large. The Behavioral Analysis Unit assisted detectives by creating a criminal profile. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed, and more than 400 men were eliminated as suspects through blood typing and DNA analysis. Murders were extremely rare in Ozark County, and in 1984, the police lacked the kind of specialized team necessary to investigate such a highly sensitive case. Cases like this typically raised concerns that the killer might strike again, and unfortunately, he did, following a disturbingly similar pattern. A friend of Tracy's, Wendy Smith, was found murdered in July 1985, just 6 months after Tracy's death. Wisconsin was now on alert, treating these as connected murders. Regarding Wendy's disappearance, she had initially been out with friends before leaving to meet her mother, who was working at a tavern. However, she never arrived at the location. Eventually, her body was discovered in a ditch along a hillside. 24 hours after she went missing, the Ozaukee Sheriff's Department and Washington Police joined forces to investigate the case. Detectives compiled a list of suspects with FBI assistance, suggesting that both murders occurred within the same social circle and followed almost identical patterns. Given the brutal nature of the assaults, investigators concluded that the killer was likely someone known to both victims. However, the forensics report altered the course of the investigation. DNA samples recovered from Wendy's body did not match those from Tracy's, although the trace evidence provided valuable information about the killer's profile. Forensic reports confirmed that the man had O-positive blood type. Additionally, 2 distinct enzymes were found in their DNA, one of which occurs in only 3% of the U.S. population. While primitive by today's standards, the blood samples could eliminate 98% of the suspects the police were holding. Investigators encouraged the family and friends of both victims to volunteer for blood tests. The hundreds of samples collected were carefully sent to the state crime lab for analysis, taking weeks or even months to produce results. After exhausting nearly every available resource, investigators were left with no matches. The case eventually fell to the bottom of the investigators' pile, and with no remaining leads, it was classified as a cold case. In April 2018, over 2,000 miles away in California, police finally achieved success regarding a notorious serial killer and rapist named Joseph James DeAngelo, infamously known as the Golden State Killer. He was charged with over 50 counts of assault and 13 counts of murder for crimes committed between 1974 and 1986. The breakthrough in tracking this cold case came through a technique called forensic genealogy. The Ozark Police Department subsequently contacted California authorities to review the Tracy Hammerberg case using this new forensic technology. The police reopened the case in March 2019, and by the end of September, they had identified 2 lead suspects. Almost 35 years later, Tracy's murderer was finally within the reach of the county authorities. 2 brothers, Eugene and Philip Cross, were found to be an exact match with the DNA samples. The Cross brothers had lived in the same neighborhood of Port Washington and Saukville in the late 1980s. While Eugene was confirmed to have long since died, Philip Cross emerged as the most likely suspect in Tracy's murder. His background history was an exact fit for the criminal's psychological profile. Philip had been a loner who tried to hang around the popular crowd, desperately seeking to fit into socially acceptable norms. He also had a previously recorded history and had initially been overlooked during the earlier investigation. Police were nearly on the cusp of apprehending their suspect when they discovered that Philip had died of a drug overdose in 2012. On August 21, 2012, Philip Cross died at the Diamond Inn in Milwaukee. Fortunately, the autopsy conducted due to the drug overdose included recorded DNA samples. The state crime lab confirmed that his DNA was an exact match to Tracy Hammerberg's murderer. 36 years after the crime, the cold case of Tracy's horrifying murder finally came to a close. While the state of Wisconsin breathed a sigh of relief at finally resolving Tracy Hammerberg's tragedy, the family and friends of the young victims continue to mourn the unfortunate turn of events. Friends to whom we owe our golden days can sometimes lead us to our graves. For Tracy and Wendy, their killer had been hiding in plain sight. We urge viewers to remain cautious and vigilant, keeping a careful eye on their loved ones. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into cold case investigations. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video. And remember, the search for truth never stops.